Hello, today I'm going to show you how to make these rather nice crocheted washcloths or flannels using one of my favourite yarns, which is this We Are Knitting's The Cotton. It's definitely not cheap, but it's really good quality and it's lovely and soft, so it's perfect for something like this or for baby blankets and such. The colours I've got here are aquamarine, natural and pearl, which actually on the website looks a bit more grey, but when you get it, it's sort of a really light kind of don't know, hazelnut colour, I suppose you'd say. It's light brown colour. So I've made it's quite nice to give as presents with a, you know, like a nice handmade bar of soap or something, or use for yourself. But I quite like having the two made in opposite colours, with the slip stitch work over the top in opposite colours too. So I've made this blue one with the white embellishment on the top. So this time I'm going to make a white one with the blue grid on the top. So this is actually pretty straightforward. There's a written pattern on my blog which is quite wordy, but again, it's not actually that complicated. I've just ended up trying to probably over explain things. So I've got a 4mm hook, and as usual I like to use my Clover Moor. I guess this cotton is Aran or worsted weight, so it's quite a thick cotton. Well, I'm used to working with double knitting, so it feels thicker to me. Okay, so I'm going to chain 44. And then I'm only going to work into the back ridges, because I actually want to leave this part of the chain visible on the bottom of the washcloth. So we're just going to skip and turn the chain over. I'm going to skip the first chain and then single crochet into the back ridge of each chain. So you can see that leaves the nice sort of V of the chain visible at the bottom, which means when we come to put the final border on, it's much easier and also just looks nicer. So the first row is done, and you should have 43 single crochets. So the next row is chain 1, turn your work, don't skip any stitches, and then it's just one single crochet into each stitch along. So I've come to the end of row 2, and row 3 is just the same as row 2, chain 1, turn your work, don't skip any stitches, and continue along doing one single crochet into each stitch. So you're just going to carry on in this way for 48 rows in total. If your gauge is different to mine, and you're maybe you need less rows or more rows, then this could affect the your grid, because the way that the slip stitches are crocheted in, it's evenly distributed between rows to get a square and columns to get the square shape. But don't worry about that too much. It really depends, you know, if you're that bothered about it being completely square or whether you're happy for oblongs. What I would say though is, because the split is 2, 4, 6, 8 rows, 2, 4, 6, 8 rows, it's probably best to try and fall within a number that's as square as possible, that's rows divisible by 4. That's the best way to split up the rows. So I've crocheted my 47 rows, and I'm now ready to put the single crochet edge along here to neaten it up and also make it easier when we put the final border on. So I'm staying with my work, I'm not fastening off, I'm going to continue round with the same yarn. I'm just going to explain how I put a single crochet edging on the side, into the side stitches of the rows. So I'm going to start off with a chain 1, and this just helps turn the corner, and then I'm actually going to skip the first row and I'm going to go into this second row. So because we've worked flat and alternating the rows, we've got some of the edges have a single crochet at the end, and some of them have a chain 1 from where this was the beginning of the row, and a single crochet there where it's the end of the row, and a chain 1 there where it was the beginning. So the principle all along is the same. I'm basically just putting 1 stitch into each of the side stitches. I'm quite lucky because my gauge more or less matches this anyway. So when I crochet the border on here, what you often see is people going round the entire stitch like this, which is quite nice and easy, but personally I find this a bit ugly or unattractive. It sort of can leave some big holes which are a bit unsightly, and it's also makes that edge a bit bulkier than the rest of the fabric. So what I like to do is I like to go through the middle of the edge stitch. So in this case it's a chain 1, so I'm going through the middle of it and catching 2 parts of the stitch and then crocheting through that. And again here where it starts with a single crochet, I'm going to go through the middle of the single crochet, and there I've caught 2 strands rather than going through the whole stitch. Again here this edge is a chain 1, just go into that. When you first start, for example here I've gone through there and I've only caught 1, you can easily readjust that to get the second strand. But what you'll find is once you get the feel of it, your hook will find the right route if you're kind of quite relaxed and just let the hook take the path of least resistance. You'll get a feel for it after a while. So here it's edge of a single crochet, starting with a single crochet. I'm going to go through the middle, catch 2 strands. Next one is a chain, you can just see it. I'm going to pop my hook straight in the middle and I've caught. So each time I'm just checking that I'm catching the 2 strands. And as you can see, that just makes a really nice, actually my gauge there is a bit loose on that one stitch. Can you see it's made it a bit wobbly? So I'm just going to pull that. It's probably just why I'm filming and not really concentrating. So if you do make an effort to try and keep your gauge nice and even here. Obviously for some people your gauge may not match exactly, your row height might not match your stitch height, might not match your stitch width, in which case if you crochet along here you might find it starts to ripple. You just need to go down half a hook size or a full hook size just to see if that makes any difference, but it's usually not too far off unless you've got a very unusual gauge. And the same if you're finding that's really tight and pulling it all together too much, then just for these borders, this sort of neatening off single crochet border, you might want to go up a hook size. So I'm just going to carry along here until I get to the bottom of the cloth. So I've finished working along this edge and it looks nice and neat. And I'm going to actually just put another row along the bottom so that I can work back up the other side without breaking off the yarn. So again, to turn the corner, I'm just going to chain one, and it's nice and easy. I'm literally just going to crochet into each of these stitches, which, if you remember, is your original chain that you started with, and you did a you crocheted leaving this nice part of the chain free because you crocheted into the back ridge originally. So that's why I really love when you start off with a chain, foundation chain, to crochet into the back ridge, because it makes subsequent borders, and or even if you're not going to put a border on, you're just leaving it, it just looks much nicer. It's easier to work into. So I'm now just going to put the border along the other side, and it's the same principle as before. You've got each row either has a chain or a single crochet at the edge, and you're going to work into either one of those alternately, obviously, and then catching in 2 strands of each. It's just slightly trickier than before because you're working into the back of the chain one and the back of the single crochet. But once you get your eye in, it's not too bad, and it's definitely worth the finished result to have a nice neat edge to put your final border on without having loads of holes along the edge. So again, I've just done a chain one and skipping the row I've just done and going into all these edges of these subsequent rows. So the first edge of a row is a chain one. So these are a bit tricky because they're quite tight, but I'm quite forceful and just push the hook through, making sure you've got 2 strands of that chain one and then single crochet. Next one's nice and easy. It's a single crochet, and you can see the back loop of that single crochet back strand. I'm going to catch that and one other strand there. So that's, next one is a knot. Again, these are a bit tricky, but once you get into it, it's quite easy. Another single crochet here. These are much looser. You can also just, you know, quickly flip the work each time until you're familiar with it, just to check you're going through the right spot. So there I can see I've gone through the middle of that chain. Here's a single crochet edge. You can see it there. If I stick my hook in and then check the other side, I can confirm that I've gone through the middle of that whilst still catching 2 strands. So when you first, if this is the first time you've done this, you might want to check each time. So here, this is a single crochet at the beginning of the row. I can see the middle of it there. I'm going to stick my hook in. That looks good. Keep going. I've obviously done this quite a bit, so you can feel more or less straight away when you've got it right. So just keep doing that all the way along. You can see that makes a nice neat edge without big holes. So I've almost finished putting the single crochets on this edge. I've got 2 rows left, one of which is the final row. So I'm just going to treat these in exactly the same way, going through the edge and catching 2 strands, and then I'm going to go just through the first single crochet as if it was a normal stitch for my last edge stitch, just like that. So you can end up right at the end with this sort of little hole here, but don't worry too much about this. You're now going to cut your yarn and leave a reasonable tail end there, and you're just going to literally pull that through without really fastening it off properly, because what we're going to do later is, after we've put the border on, if you do end up with a little hole here, which I seem to end up with every single time, this tail end here, I'm actually going to sew that in there, sew it round the stitches around that hole, and just tighten it off to get rid of it, and then sew the end in along this nice single crochet border. So it's my finished base of my washcloth. Is curling a bit, as I said, don't worry too much about that, because it does sort itself out. So now I'm going to put the slip stitch design element on the top of that, and the first thing we need to do is mark off where we're going to do the horizontal rows. The horizontal rows are the easiest to do, because if you look at the rows, you can see that every 2 rows is very easy to identify, because you've got this almost like a little valley or a ridge running every 2 rows. And if we look at another washcloth I've made, you'll see that the horizontal lines are every 2, 4, 6, 8 rows. So we're just going to get some stitch markers. I think you need 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, yeah, you need 6 stitch markers, just to mark off along here where your design elements are going to run along. So I'm going to mark these off, the horizontal rows, as every 8 rows, but we've got 2 half blocks at the end, so it's 4 rows to start with. So that's 2, 4 there. 2, 4, 6, 8. That's the next one. 2, 4, 6, 8. The next one. 2, 4, 6, 8. So that's my markings, and it's all, I've done the right number of rows because I've got 4 rows this end, 4 rows at the top, and 8 in between each. So now I'm going to start my crochet slip stitch embellishment. So you need to leave a tail when you start so that you've got something to sew in at the end when you're weaving in all your ends. So if you've never done this before, it's really easy, but it does feel a bit awkward to start with. So don't worry too much. You'll feel a bit cack-handed, but once you get the hang of it, it's dead easy. So I'm leaving a bit of a tail here. I'm taking out this first marker. I'm going to start. I'm going to try and start as close to the edge as possible. Remember, we've got this row of single crochet, so don't worry too much about not starting bang on the edge, because I'll show you later on how we tackle that. So literally, you're just working between each stitch, and your hook should naturally find the path between the stitches, because it's the path of least resistance along this ridge. So I'm holding the yarn at the back, and I've left a tail for sewing in later, and then I'm just hooking through, and then off I go into the next stitch. So I've just pulled up a loop, then I go into the next stitch, grab the yarn, pull it through the loop on the hook, go into the next stitch. So I'm just slip stitching all the way along. I'm going to zoom in a bit. And as you can see, my hook naturally finds the next stitch, gap between the stitch rather. So when I've taught this before, the biggest issue people have is that they, because they can't see the yarn behind. So initially there is a bit of, you just got to get the hang of it. You might find yourself fumbling around a bit to start with, but eventually it is this easy. It becomes quite rhythmic. I would say also just be careful to try and keep your tension relatively loose. You don't want it too tight because it will pucker up your work, and slip stitch does tend to be quite a tight stitch. So I've done this a lot, so I've sort of programmed myself to be relatively loose. You don't want it really loose because it will look messy. You want to keep the stitches nice and even, but not too tight. And once you've done it, once you've seen this, you think, well, actually, makes you realise that the slip stitch is just a chain, really. You're just chaining, but with a fabric in between, which had never occurred to me before. All these years of crocheting and slip stitching, it had never occurred to me that a slip stitch is literally just a chain through the fabric. No, I actually really enjoy this because it's, once you get going, it's quite rhythmic and you don't have to think too much, and it just makes a really nice effect. So I'm just going to keep going. So as you get closer to the edge, you don't want to go right up to the edge, because you don't want to work right into that single crochet edge, because we're going to put a final border in. So we just go up to that single crochet border and then cut the yarn, making sure you leave enough thread for sewing in after. And then just pull it all the way through. You're not actually fastening off, because when we've put the final border on, I'll show you how to complete the edge so that it does look like it's running right up to the edge and not just stopping in midair. So now carry on and make all the other horizontal slip stitch embellishments. So here I've finished my horizontal slip stitch embellishment, and I'm now going to place the markers for the vertical rows, which are every 7 stitches with 4 at each side. So I find it easier to work, do the markings by working on counting these little ridges, like looks like a little pearl stitch, to mark the stitches. So 1, 2, 3, 4. That's where my first line is going to go. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Second. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Again, you're going between the stitches. You should have 4 left on the end. Let's do that out again. So you can see I've marked these off evenly, ready to do my vertical rows, which are slightly different. It's not difficult, it's just slightly not as easy as these nice, easy to find ones that you're just slotting in along these ridges. Because if you look at your single crochet, you're trying to work up between the columns of stitches, and if you look at them, you'll see that they don't fall exactly one on top of the other. They sort of go left, right, left, right, left, right, left, very, very slightly. You just got to work in that very, very slight zigzag of between the stitches, left, right, left, right, left, right, and the finished result is still a straight line, as you can see here. So don't worry too much about it. Again, once you get used to it, you just instinctively can crochet along, and it's quite easy to spot when you've gone wrong. So let's just start, and as before, we're just working between the columns of stitches. But I'm going to try and start as close to the edge as possible, leaving a tail to sew in. So what you've got to just watch out a bit for now is the tails from the previous rows you've crocheted in. They can get in the way a bit. Okay, so when you actually get to this horizontal bar, you've got to crochet through the middle of the stitch. So first of all, the first one is always a bit of an experiment because you're not sure whether you get hit the right spot or not. So I'm going to guess that it's in the middle of this one, and you need to go straight through the middle of it and then do your stitch as normal, and then continue along, making sure you're always 4 stitches, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 in from the edge. So looking at this now, that is a bit wobbly, and looking at the back you can see I've missed the mark, so I'm just going to pull that out. It takes, the first one is always tricky because it's never quite where you think it is. Okay, so it must be this one here. I'm going to go into that one, pull up my stitch, and then if you then think, oh, I've lost where I was, don't forget it's 4 in from the edge. 1, 2, 3, 4. So then that sets me off again in the right direction. Okay, so let's have a look. Yep, that's much better. It's a bit loose where I am trying to film and crochet at the same time. But that's okay, I'm happy with that. And then you could check the back. It's always good to check the back, because the back really shows you whether you've hit spot on the right stitch. And again, I'm just going to carry on along here, going between the columns of stitches. And actually once you've done one, as long as you've started each horizontal bar in exactly the same spot, it's quite easy to work out, you know, where to go if you're still a bit worried, because you just count from the previous one. You did 1, 2, 3. I went into the 4th one. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, see, it's a bit further to the right than my eye is telling me. So I'll just tighten that up a bit, because I loosened the loop to count. So, and again, once you've done this bit, this is always the point where I think, oh, not sure where I am. Don't forget it's 4 on this starting edge. 1, 2, 3, 4 there. And then this bit, you kind of quite easy. Whoops. Difficult to crochet and film at the same time. So that's looking okay. So I'm just going to carry on up to in the same way all the way up until I get to this top edge. So again, I've just stopped short of the final border. I'm just going to trim my yarn, pull that out, and we'll sort that out later. So, if we have just a quick check on the back, it's all good. It should all be lined up nicely. So I'm just going to continue now making these vertical stripes across there. So now I've finished the slip stitch border design. I'm ready to ready to make the reverse single crochet border. I'm going to start, you can start on any edge between any of these elements. It's just best not to start right where one of these is coming up to the edge, because you'll want to sew the ends in. Actually finish off this design so it goes all the way up to the edge, and if you've started there, it just makes a bit of a lump. So I'm going to start just about here. I'm going to leave a tail long enough at the back to sew in later. So I'm just going to pull the yarn through from the back and chain one, and then I'm going to go straight into the next stitch. So because this is reverse single crochet, instead of going into the stitch to the left of the one you've just done, you're going into the right stitch. And it is still just a single crochet, but you do have to tweak it slightly because of going in the different direction. So you grab the yarn as normal, pull it through, but as you pull through, if you tilt the hook backwards, so by backwards I mean this end of the hook towards away from you, and then pull it up to lengthen that loop you've just pulled through, and then yarn over and draw off the two. So again, we go into the next stitch to the right, grab the yarn, and as we pull it through, we're just going to tilt the hook backwards and then twist it round, lengthening the loop on the hook. And the reason we do this is because if you just try and crochet as normal, what happens is you when you pull through this loop, the most common mistake people make is they pull through this loop and they accidentally pull it straight through the loop that's already on the hook. So we'll just go over that again. So you insert the hook into the stitch to the right, grab the yarn, and as you pull it through the end of the hook, you tilt it away from you, and then twist the hook end of the hook up slightly to lengthen that loop that you've just pulled through, because that's what helps give this lovely textured effect. If you keep the loop on this hook too tight, you don't get the same effect, the nice definition of the stitches. Into the stitch to the right, grab the yarn, tilt the hook to the back as you put it through, and then lengthen the loop on the hook. Yarn over, draw off the two. Go into the stitch at the right, grab the yarn as you pull it through, tilt the end of the hook to the back of the work, pull the loop loose or a bit longer. So it does feel quite awkward to start with, but as you see, once you get the feel of it, it's actually pretty quick, and it's just a really nice stitch that if you first saw it you wouldn't even know it was crochet really, if you didn't know what it was. It's almost like a sort of braided effect or a sewn effect. It sort of reminds me a bit of the piping you get on upholstery sometimes, you know, because it's nice and stiff, and it really does give a nice finish to a project. So you're just going to go all the way around, except when you come to a corner. So the only thing with this stitch is normally with a corner you would increase on a square, you'd increase round the corner, but with this stitch, if you try and put two into one, it looks a bit messy. So what I'm going to do is just a chain one, but because if you look at this stitch, you can see it falls quite far to the right. Once you've made it, it falls quite far to the right, so you need to make the chain one stitch before the last stitch. So I've come up to here, I've got one stitch left. I'm going to chain one, but then I'm not going to skip any stitches. I'm just going to go into there, into the next stitch, and then carry on round the corner. This is a chain one for the previous row, so it's a bit awkward to get into. And then there's not really a perfect way to turn the corner with this stitch. I just found that putting the chain one in just before you turn the corner is the best solution. So you can see from these it looks okay. It's not perfect, but as I said, if you try and put two stitches into one, tends to look pretty messy. So the best thing is just to put one chain in, one stitch before the last, and then don't skip any stitches. It just gives a bit of extra kind of space working around the corner. You can experiment as well. If that doesn't look good for your type of crochet, you can see what would happen if you put the chain one in two stitches before the end, or put another chain one in afterwards if it's still too rounded for your liking. there's not really a definitive way of doing it. You've just got to do what looks best, really. So to finish off, when we've been making this reverse single crochet in the round, we just continue round until we get back to the spot where we did the chain one, and we put another reverse single crochet in the very first bit where we put the very first stitch where we put the chain one, and then we cut the yarn and we pull the tail all the way out. You can't really slip stitch this, you can't end this with a slip stitch like you would normally, because of the way the stitches fall so much to the right. So once you've pulled it through, you then need to initially sew the ending following the direction that the stitch is falling. So I'm actually going to turn the work over. Oop, just unthreaded that. I'm going to sew it through the first few stitches I made, and then just check that it matches, so you can actually blend it in really well. So you can, you know, especially then also if you tighten up that first chain one you made, it blends in pretty well. And then I'm just going to catch one of the legs of another one of the reverse single crochets there, and just go back a couple of stitches, and then that's nice and secure. And then while I'm here, I'm also going to sew in the first, at the start of that reverse single crochet in a similar way. Just catch it under a few, make sure it matches the tension of what you've crocheted. Catch a leg of another stitch, go back on itself a couple of stitches, trim that off. So now we've got to sort out all these ends where they're not all these slip stitch rows where they're not starting right at the edge. So we're going to sew them in and finish off these lines all in one go with a needle and thread, well, the thread, the tail end. And you're basically just making like a mock stitch with the needle. So this is the start of a column, so I'm going to try and, as closely as possible, bring the needle up in a directly, vertically, you know, as in a straight line to match what I've already done. So I've threaded it directly below, coming out from the border, and then I'm going to go through both elements of this, both loops of this stitch, and then back down exactly where I came up, and then you can see I've just imitated the slip stitch surface design, and then as I did before, I'm going to run it along the reverse single crochet border for about an inch or so, catch in one of the legs of the single crochet, reverse single crochet, and go back a little bit. Make sure it matches my tension and snip that off. So there you can see I've sewn in the end, and at the same time finished off this design element nicely so that it butts straight up to the border. So that's how you do the start of a slip stitch element. The end is very similar. So here's one where we've got the end. I'm going to thread my needle. And I'm basically going to make a kind of, I suppose you can do it in embroidery, I think it's called a chain stitch. So I make a loop like this, come up directly above from the border, catch the loop, go up through the middle of the loop, and then go back down into border. And you can see I've just made another chain element, and then I'm going to do the same as before. I'm going to hide the tail in the border. Cut that off. I'm going to carry on like that. For the rest of them until they're all sewn in. And these, the ends of your actual the main body of the flannel face cloth, they can also be sewn into this border, and that's the good thing about sewing all the ends into the border. The border can kind of conceal a lot of stuff because it's quite a sturdy border, quite thick, and then you're not adding any additional lumps and bumps to your main work, and it's also less likely to come undone when people are using it as well. Another way to do this top one, if you didn't want to make the loop, is literally to just sew it through an element of the border and then come straight back down exactly where you came out of. That's another way. That's actually probably slightly easier. And again, you're just gonna hide the tail in the border.